you're back on the Zero Hour. I am, as always, your host, Richard RJ Eskow. As we continue our coverage of the year that is about to hopefully leave us behind, and vice versa, we turn now to our friend Matt Taibbi. You know Matt's writing. He is a contributing editor at Rolling Stone. You can find all of his ongoing writing at taibbi.substack.com. He's also the author of a number of books, so check him out at your favorite non-monopolistic bookstores. And without any further ado, Matt Taibbi, welcome back to the program.
Thanks for having me. How's it going?
Well, let's start here. I'm constantly overwhelmed when I start a new discussion with anyone about the year that just passed because there's so much going on. But let's start here. As you probably know, at least one press organization has applied to have journalists designated as essential workers so that we can get it further advanced on the line for a COVID vaccine. And, one part of me says, great, we are essential workers. We ought to get it. And actually, because of some health issues of my own, I was really bummed that I couldn't go cover the BLM protests, for example, here in DC. But one part of me says that's good. Another part of me says this profession didn't earn it this year. So why don't we start there? Did we earn the designation of essential workers as an industry or as a profession in 2020?
I don't think so. Generally speaking, it was not a good year for the media. It hasn't been a good 4 or 5 years for the media, I would say. And part of that is because they rechristened themselves as political operatives, essentially, right? I mean, going back to the very beginning of the Trump era, they started this new sort of ring around the collar style marketing campaign that said that if you don't use this product, democracy will die in darkness. Right. And the news media kind of radically transformed its core mission, I think, during the Trump years, from being a sort of neutral arbiter of information. Of course, it never really was that, but it at least superficially strove for that. And it turned into something else that was more like an entertainment product, and it was heavily based on, I think, addicting people to the experience of being outraged about things, which was not that hard to do in the Trump era. So I think, the news media has a lot to answer for in terms of helping create some of the really unfortunate conditions that we're looking at in the United States right now, with people really at each other's throats and completely on different planets when it comes to trying to agree on common sets of facts. They just don't exist anymore. We can't really have a national argument because there are no commonly agreed upon sets of facts anymore. And I think the media has a lot to answer for there. So I don't know. It's tough to argue otherwise. It feels like.
And you wrote a book, Hate Incorporated, about the media's kind of evolution from what it never was, but aspired to be at least, and sometimes was, which was, presenter of facts, to really a replication of the social media model of, if we can get you inflamed, if we can get you agitated, if we can trigger you, you will read us, you will click, you will subscribe. So in essence, even though most professional editors and journalists will condemn social media, they've become the thing they condemn. And to me, now what's striking is how many people in the profession of journalism act, as well as how many liberals and Democrats actually argue for the suppression of facts and information. And I wonder if I imagine you have thoughts about that as well.
Oh, absolutely. And this has been a terrible year for that too. There were, I think, really important moments in the history of this new movement to, they call it the content moderation movement, right? But really what it is we've got a a fully privatized distribution landscape that's dominated by a couple of monopolistic tech companies. So it's easier than it ever was before to not completely control, but to control the bulk of the news landscape. If a couple of companies decide they're not going to distribute certain stories, then you have what amounts to a near total blackout of certain things. And they've been doing this kind of steadily ever since they first started. They kicked off Alex Jones, right, which almost everybody agreed with, because who doesn't hate Alex Jones? But it steadily progressed, which I think we both predicted at the time that would happen. That the tendency of these censorship movements is that they gradually expand the list of targets. And to me, the scariest moment was the decision by Twitter and Facebook to block access to the New York Post expose about Hunter Biden and his emails and what was on that laptop. Now, I don't necessarily think that was such an important story. It might have been, it might have been a real corruption story, but they operated from the assumption that this was fake news and it had to be suppressed. And as we found out just a week ago, he is under investigation for offenses that seem strikingly like the things that were outlined in those emails. And what that signals, especially to conservative audiences, is that we have a politicized, monopolistic distribution model that is going to suppress some information and highlight some others. And I really worry about that, because I just don't think a lot of people have thought through where that's going to go. There's a real kind of Orwellian angle to this that is quite scary, I think. And 2020 was a terrible year in terms of advancing that trend.
Not only do I agree with you, Matt Taibbi, but I actually think there's a dimension of this discussion that doesn't get discussed enough, which is I think it's morally wrong. I think it's immoral. And the fact that I voted for Joe Biden doesn't change the fact that I do not believe we should have a media that decides which stories must be suppressed in order to pursue a desired political outcome, even if that outcome is the same one that at this moment, I agree with. Because when the Democratic primaries were over, I wanted Joe Biden to defeat Donald Trump. Now, but ethically, morally, in terms of the society I want to live in, I also want free access to information so that I can make that choice for myself. And not only, and I will end my rant to let you talk in a second, but that not only that, but the fact is, not only did our media collude with the digital monopolies to suppress that New York Post story by claiming that it was fake news, they generated fake news in order to discredit it in the eyes of anyone who might have seen it. They said it's Russian information, the laptop isn't his, whatever. The fact is, the whole story claiming that it was Russian misinformation was, again, the thing they claimed to condemn, which is fake news.
Right. No, absolutely. And I totally agree with you that it's immoral. I also think it's really fundamentally un-American, right? Like one of the core concepts of American society, as outlined by people like Jefferson, was this idea that yes, the newspapers, free newspapers, are full of garbage. They have a tendency to make things up and to be full of gossip and lies and all sorts of things. But that is preferable to the alternative of official lies and gossip, which, when you have a monopoly, and the state has a monopoly on information, or when the sort of ruling class has a monopoly on information, then you get the worst of all possible worlds. You get lies that can't be countered, right? And that's what I worry about with the situation. It's not just that they're suppressing stories that they're calling misinformation. When you do that, you're embracing the other misinformation that you were talking about, right? You're giving it credence, you're officializing it. So, when you have 50 former intelligence officials signing a letter saying this has all the earmarks of Russian misinformation, which is a total end around, around
Right.
saying
Right.
anything concrete, right? But it has the effect of, convincing people. Uh, you're not only taking away real news, uh, you're you're giving more credence to this official fake stuff, and like a snowballing phenomenon that can happen really quickly, where you just end up with sort of one version of things, and it could easily be deceptive. It is.
And the paradox of their position, going back to the original and, in my view, highly deceptive report of the intelligence bureaucracy in January of 2017, claiming that Russian disinformation was everywhere. The paradox of their position is that they say the goal of the Russian disinformation is to undermine faith in American democratic institutions, which is exactly what they're doing. So not you and I aren't Putin's puppets in that narrative. They're Putin's puppets, because every time they spread another false story about vote hacking, that Hillary votes were flipped, as New York Times said, to Trump votes. And so every time they spread another one of these stories, or the Hunter Biden story, it's Russian disinformation that was planted in an American newspaper, they are undermining trust in democratic institutions. So
Absolutely, and I thought it was amazing in the week, maybe like the 2 weeks leading up to the election. The news agencies were flooded with stories that were basically based around anonymous quotes from intelligence officials saying it's going to be even worse this time than last time. The Russians are really up to something this time. They're going to hack vote tallies. They're going to be influencing. Spreading propaganda through people who might appear to be real Americans. Like they were full of these kinds of stories, which, as you point out, accomplished exactly what they said they were trying to suppress. And it should raise the question among journalists, like, why are they going public with this stuff? Like, what's the utility in
right.
people from the NSA and the CIA and the CISA, which whatever that information agency is, why are they constantly going to the media and telling us these things when they never did before, right? Of course, they must have had threats and indications before, but why is it public now? And I think it's pretty obvious they're meddling in the psychology of ordinary people, because it's a political power play, which is pretty freaky.
It's what the intelligence services have done in other countries and
Exactly.
trained to do for decades and decades. When Trump announces that he's going to draw down troops in Afghanistan, and within a week, there are unsubstantiated stories from the intelligence service that the Taliban is offering bounties on individual American soldiers, a story never verified. Cui bono, right? Who benefits
Of
from that?
course.
The entire military and intelligence apparatus that does not want us to withdraw from Afghanistan. Am I drawing the wrong conclusion there?
Absolutely not. And that was, it's obvious to a handful of people who are really paying attention to that kind of stuff, but they don't have the impact in pushing back on those kinds of narratives that journalists might have once upon a time, right? There isn't that, Seymour Hersh level
Right.
person that the public trusts more than they trust the government, and that's the real worry that we have right now. With, like, the media has been so degraded in the eyes of the public for a variety of reasons, that its ability to prevent or to block those kinds of shenanigans has been completely stripped away. And yeah, they'll allow a couple of people like you and me to squawk about it, maybe, right? I
Right.
mean,
So far.
so
Up to
far,
now. Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
But they've done so well in kind of conquering all the major corporate news outlets in terms of spreading their propaganda there, that yeah, stories like that, which just had such obvious utility to the intelligence agencies, and that, let's face it, they don't even have to be fake, those stories. they can be just manipulated. Like you could have a guy in Afghanistan who says, "Hey, this looks like it might be this." That's one of six possibilities, and that goes
Right.
up the chain, and then somebody whispers to a reporter, "Hey, that was part of a discussion we had the other day." That's a true story, right? But you can
Right.
blow it into fantastic proportions, and that's what people don't understand, is that the press can be manipulated that way.
And I blanking on his name, but a former editor, I think, and journalism professor said recently, the problem is our industry hasn't figured out what to do with, his phrase was, the weaponization of facts.
I don't know. I
And
haven't
so
heard
he
that.
was arguing, I guess, for the suppression of facts, because facts can be weapons in what he would consider the wrong hands. But it seems to me we unearth the facts and present them. And if somebody misuses them or distorts them, we unearth more facts about how they're being misused. But it's never this self-censorship that's become de rigueur in certain kind of circles right now.
Yeah, and in this sense, Trump has been a boon to the whole intelligence community. I mean, think about what was going on before Trump got elected. You go back to 2014, 2015. Where was liberal America's heads at the time? They were upset about the Iraq War. They had been angry enough about programs like rendition and torture and Guantanamo Bay and all that stuff to elect Obama over Hillary Clinton in the belief that he would fix those things.
Right.
They had just heard the Snowden revelations and they were upset about that. They had done Occupy because they were mad at Wall Street. And all of a sudden, sort of magically, Trump comes along and all those concerns are gone. And now the people who were villains in 2015 are suddenly the
Right.
stalwart defenders of democracy that are beloved most of all by political liberals. Now, how did they pull that off? Like, why does nobody think about that? But that's how it worked out.
Oh, no question. And again, we're talking with Matt Taibbi, author and journalist. And that's exactly what happened. It's a way that I would say that the elites, for lack of a less cliched perhaps term, but it's a way that the elites reinforced their position and almost performed a kind of political jujitsu on the public.
Oh yeah.
And now, if you don't mind, Matt, I wouldn't mind pivoting to another way that I think the elites have performed a kind of political jujitsu by talking about the state of the left in 2020, because you, among others, got in the middle of a couple big conflicts around this. And to me, what has happened in the last several years, peaking in 2020, is that really for the first time that I can think of, certainly in American history, maybe anywhere, we've had the notion of identity and the rights that accrue to different groups set in direct opposition to the notion of class, if you want to call it class, or economic rights. And in fact, it's my view that, and the view of others, that financially powerful people have deliberately turned certain groups against each other. I mean, Martin Luther King was a democratic socialist. Gandhi believed in economic self-sufficiency. We could go down the whole list. Malcolm X believed in economic social self-sufficiency. Now somehow we're being told that it's racist to support a Bernie Sanders who talks about class, or and certainly not every civil rights leader, but most oppose this way of thinking. But there's a new class of pundit who says, the hell with working class, white people, they've just not exercised their privilege wisely because they're stupid, so they deserve what they, I could go down the list, but basically I always go back to, in 2017, Marcos Malitsis of the Daily Kos, writing that he was glad that West Virginia coal miners were going to lose their black lung coverage because they voted for this, they deserve what they get. This whole notion that people are entitled to die one of the most horrible imaginable human deaths because your party did not present them with a credible case for why they should be supported. I'll stop there. You get what I'm driving at.
No, absolutely, and I completely agree with you. I wrote about this recently. For me, I looked back at it, and I could even pinpoint a date that I think this phenomenon really kind of took off. I think the date was February 13th, 2016. Hillary was kind of in a dogfight with Bernie Sanders at the time.
Right.
Sanders was gaining ground. The issue that was really hurting her was having accepted $600,000 from Goldman Sachs, and with her husband $153 million over a period of years from a bunch of these big companies. And so her campaign was taking water on this issue of we're aligned, we're in bed with Wall Street. And they tried all these different techniques to try to deflect attention from that. But it wasn't until she gave a speech where she said, if we broke up the banks tomorrow, would that end racism? Would it end sexism? Would it end prejudice against the LGBTQ communities, right? And it made no sense, right? But
Right.
the actual, but what she essentially did is she created a zero sum formulation where if you're thinking about X, you are taking away from attention for Y. And so therefore agitation for working class people equals disenfranchising minorities and encouraging racism and so on. And I think what a lot of not only the Democratic Party, but a lot of these big companies have discovered in the last 4 years is that it's a lot easier to, put up a banner that says Black Lives Matter above your homepage, right? For Amazon.com or whatever it is, Wells Fargo, then actually do something to improve the lot of your workers or whatever it is. They've made it, I think, an extremely cynical decision to present these issues as being in opposition to one another. And of course, what it's done is created a schism between people on, who are sort of left of center, right? And they're bogged down in this argument rather than thinking about how they can get rid of these politicians who've been gobbling up money from Wall Street and big pharmaceutical companies and insurance companies for 30 or 40 years now. And yeah, it's been incredibly effective. And this year, I think it reached kind of an apotheosis, especially after the Floyd incident.
Yeah, well, you had Jamie Dimon,
Yeah.
CEO of JP Morgan Chase, taking the knee
Right.
with some of his employees. You had all these bank executives coming out. I wrote about this actually, but with these wonderful statements of support for Black Lives Matter. Not one of them offered to give back the funds that they've drained over many decades from Black communities through redlining and Baltimore alone.
Yeah.
Wells Fargo built Baltimore Black homeowners out of hundreds of millions of dollars over a 5-year period. There was a study on it. They didn't offer to give that money back. They just said, oh, we support you. And to me, this is, and if you talk, the other thing that's always bothered me about this, Matt Taibbi, is that the rhetoric of, let's not talk about the working class voter. Let's talk about Black and brown and LGBTQ and these voters, is that all of those communities, Black, brown, LGBTQ, whichever, anyone you want to name, are working class, primarily working class. So you're actually screwing them economically in the name of paying lip service to an anodyne kind of support that pretends to care about them but doesn't affect them materially.
Yeah, and yeah, that's exactly right. You bring up the example of Wells Fargo. They got busted in that whole scandal where they were joking about selling ghetto loans. Remember that?
Right? I forgot. Yeah.
To mud people. I think that was in the complaint.
And by the way, I legally, I think, hacked MERS, the company that was doing it. And I downloaded a lot of their training materials. One of them for how to report a foreclosure was one loser lane, Jacksonville, Florida, Jacksonville being an epicenter. I mean, just the amazing things that you see, this bigoted culture that permeates them. And you also wrote about white fragility.
Mm-mm.
this whole notion that the best way for white people to serve or be good allies to Black and brown communities is through endless self-reflection in a permanent loop of abasement. Not a basement, self-abasing, and but maybe being in a basement too. And I've often thought that I would love to get 100 single Black moms who are working, double shifts, where their shifts get at fast food restaurants or something, in a room and say, okay, would you rather have laws that give you sick leave and demand and require your employer to tell you a week in advance what your shifts are going to be so you can get childcare plus $15 an hour? Or would you rather that 1 million white people engaged in endless self-recrimination about, their inner bigotry?
And congratulated themselves about it.
And congratulated themselves for knowing, it is a weird, I'm pretty sure I know how that would go.
Absolutely. Yeah. And that phenomenon is so strange. They were, I mean, on one level, it's kind of just a brilliant marketing ploy. Like let's monetize the guilt of upper class, white people who live in segregated neighborhoods and work in jobs where they don't have to deal with working class people or minorities very often. Right? That's pretty easy to do. But again, I think the core of it is, a lot of these big companies, they would rather deal with public criticism on the level of an HR problem that they can address by hiring armies of Robin DiAngelos to come and give speeches to their workforce and to ruthlessly police whatever communications go on between employees. Like that's much easier to do than to reform to pay people higher wages or to stop selling predatory loans in poor communities or whatever it is, right? So, they've created a kind of a Potemkin village appearance of social progressivism, which is going to inoculate them from criticism on other things. But the white fragility movement is weird on so many levels, and it's debasing, and I think it makes everybody uncomfortable, white and Black. I talked to some people in the New York City school system who had some very unpleasant experiences with having to undergo these kinds of trainings that are now kind of standard in lots of places. And it causes a lot of problems between the races, I think. But they haven't gotten around to figuring that out yet, or if they do know it, they don't really care, is what I worry about.
And that leads us to Matt Taibbi, to the whole question of what seems to me, there's been a lot of heat and light about this as well, and sort of partial truths on all sides. But one thing seems clear to me, which is large elements of the left, at least as broadly defined, have adopted a deeply unforgiving and, emotionally at least, or psychically non-inclusive tone. In other words, look, I was raised I was born in the 1950s, raised in the 50s and 60s, and there's no doubt that a lot, those were racist, homophobic times, a lot of sexist, a lot of those tropes are deeply embedded in the culture. I don't doubt that I haven't unearthed all of them, for example. I don't doubt there are others lurking in there. But the question becomes, and I don't need to personalize it with me, the question becomes, if somebody says something, I will give you a personal example. I used the term, I got gypped a few years ago. I didn't know the derivation of the term. I guess maybe I could have figured out GYP comes from gypsy and the reputation Romany people had for being dishonest or whatever. But I didn't know the etymology of the word. I never thought about it. And I got called a racist. I said, why? It wasn't, Richard, that term has a racially bigoted origin. You shouldn't use it. It was my essence that was challenged as you are a racist. It seems to me that has become endemic in many circles of the left, that whereas we once sought to educate others, increasingly, especially seems to me in the last year or two, we seek to condemn them. And not what they did wrong, but the essence of who they are as human beings is fundamentally bad. It's almost like a return to Puritanism or something. It's like, well, anyway, I've said enough. Your
No,
thoughts
no,
on that?
yeah, I think you're right. I mean, like, I just turned 50. I think most people, as they get older, have to grapple with the idea that some of the ideas that we were raised with are probably regressive, and our reactions to things that to us seem totally normal, maybe to the next generation aren't, and that's a totally normal process that I think every generation goes through. What's different about this is that this is a political movement that is taking hold of the country, but it's deeply pessimistic and negative. It doesn't believe in the power of regeneration or redemption, forgiveness. There's none of that kind of classic, sort of Christian theology that was part of, say, like a lot of the liberation movements in the 60s and 70s,
Right.
which were underneath the rhetoric of people like Martin Luther King. But and those eras produced amazing art, I think, because of it, right? Because a lot of the ideas behind the liberation movements of the 60s and 70s were that this sort of repressive dogmas of conformist 50s American culture and our apartheid politics, they were keeping us apart. They were suppressing what was beautiful about the human spirit, and we're gonna blow those doors open, and it's all gonna be beautiful, and let's rock and roll and all these things. And it was cool, right? This is different. This is negative and punitive. It comes from a place of it's young people who are staring at a future where they don't see a lot of opportunity for themselves. They think they've been lied to by their parents about the whole structure of their society, which is why they're so interested in going back and tearing down icons like whether it's Jefferson or Lincoln or whatever. And I think they've been seduced by a new brand of politics that is very absolutist and puritanical. It's a little bit Marxian, but they're very obsessed with this idea of good and bad people.
Right.
Some people are just bad, and that's why lines like the basket of deplorables, or Joe Biden saying that 25% of all people are bad or just bad people, like those resonate now in ways that never would have existed before. And it's the opposite of what we used to think of as liberal politics, right? Like when I was growing up, people were in favor of prison reform precisely because we believed in the idea that somebody who might have done something terrible once upon a time, everybody has the ability to be redeemed in some level, right? But we don't really believe that anymore. There's a thing that's going on in American culture that's really strange and new for us. And I'm with you. I worry about it a lot. I don't know where it's leading, but it's kind of scary.
I worry about it too because for many reasons. One, it just doesn't seem humane, but also because it prevents, and maybe this is why it's being encouraged on some level, it prevents the building of alliances across demographic groups, across background, across generations, and encourages us yet just one more way to turn us against each other, instead of saying, maybe that old racist person can get together with that young, trans person of color and this person over here. Maybe they can all get together and work on their common problems. It's the exact opposite of that. This one has to say that one's fundamentally evil. So of course we don't have any obligation to think of each other or to act as a national community, because you're bad and I'm good, and that's just the way it is. And I may not be perfect, but I'm better than you, so there's no reason to work together.
Yeah, that's a good point, and I wonder if some of that is because sort of the upper class or upper middle class America is a lot more segregated actually than the rest of America is, right? Like, you know, if you've ever spent any time around the
Right.
military, or go to churches in the South, or work on a construction site or whatever it is, like people get along. Like people who have very different politics superficially, they're fine. They get along. They'll argue, but
Right.
but for the most part, they're cool with each other. Americans are actually kind of a nice people, actually, on the surface. But we've been presented with this flood of propaganda that suggests that no, actually, it's not like that. It's half of us are evil, and are unredeemable, and we no longer have to think about them. And I think it's very interesting that those messages are coming from the leaders of society,
Yeah,
rather
I hadn't
rather
thought about that. Yeah, you're
right?
right.
And
Yeah.
so what is that about? Like what's their interest in making sure that we don't see the good in each other? I don't. I mean, and if you say this to people who, you know, are protesting for social justice and all that, they'll say, "Well, that's just code. That's just you're condoning racism and you're coddling people who have regressive attitudes." And I don't think that's what it is. I think the if you go back to the civil rights movements of the 60s and 70s, it succeeded precisely because they were able to win over the consciences of people who had been living in that apartheid system, right? That like they won on the level of
Right.
the human spirit, right? And that's what's not going on now. So I worry about that.
Yeah, and I guess my last observation is I'd like to say I'm never intimidated, but actually I am. I can think of at least one story I didn't write because I just didn't want to deal with the crap of, and I'll tell you what it is, and then maybe, but it was uh, an African American CEO of a bank, of a financial institution, said, he identified with George Floyd. He realized that could have been him, which it could have been, but it got me thinking about like a wealthy black person versus a poor white person. What's the likelihood of them being killed by police? So I dove into the statistics later. Matt Brunig did it a little differently, but I dove into the statistics and found like, because when I was just like a relatively well-to-do working class white kid, I got hassled by the cops a lot, because I had long hair and all that. But I just got me thinking about that. And yeah, a poor white kid is more likely to be killed or beaten up by cops than a black millionaire based on a zip code analysis. So I just thought, well, that's an interesting fact, right? Class and race. But at every class level, a black person is more likely to be harmed than a white person. So it's still racism at every level, but there's also classism involved in police violence. Then I just thought, what? I'm not ready for the grief right now.
Right.
And I'm not ready to lose my show because people complain or whatever else. And I'm ashamed of it now, to be honest, but that's how intense the emotion has gotten on the left, or that's how chicken I am, one or the other. But certainly that heat is out there. And you, as a person who's received that heat, must know that even better than me.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I certainly make that calculation all the time. Like, how much grief do I really want to take over X, Y, or Z issue, right? Because you're going to get a lot, for saying all kinds of things. Like, I gave an interview on Chapo Trap House a little while ago. I think it was during the summer after the Floyd protests, because I wrote a book called I Can't Breathe about Eric
Right.
Garner's murder, and we were just sort of chatting about police, and I made an observation that I thought was a totally anodyne observation, which was that not all cops are monsters. In fact, there's a significant percentage of them who really hate the way that police do their policing strategies in big cities. They hate things like stop and frisk. They think it's ineffective, and it puts them in a position where they can't gain the trust of the population. And they also think that it incentivizes people who are horrible at the job to use strong arm tactics rather than talking. So, ultimately, though, all I was really saying is, like, sometimes the input of the people who actually do the job is important, because you get some insight into why things go wrong.
Right.
And the reaction to it was like I was saying that I was like pro police or something like that, or that I was I don't know, and that's what I worry about. It's like you can't have a conversation where you're not constantly signaling what side you're on things, and
where
that,
you're not allowed even to be wrong.
Right.
I mean, maybe I wouldn't have gotten it right. Maybe maybe I wouldn't have placed the emphasis on race and class exactly right. Although it was clear to me that there's a racist effect at every level. Whatever your case. Although I think your statement is anodyne, but to me, the ability to say something and be wrong and have a debate about it, and then, you're right, you have a good point. I'm going to refine what I said. To me, that gets lost too. And when that gets lost, our ability to advance our thinking, as well as our ability to work together, just get destroyed.
Yeah, I may have brought this up on your show before, but there's a story that I love about the Soviet writer Isaac Babel, who was one of my favorite writers growing up. But he gave a speech in the 30s, at the peak of Stalinism, and I think it was for the Union of Soviet Writers. And he said something along the lines of, people complain that our freedoms have been taken away, but they really haven't. All that Comrade Stalin's done is taken away our right to write badly, right? And people cheered, but he was saying something actually that was quite powerful, which is, like, in order to write well, you have to be able to write badly sometimes. Like, you got to make mistakes in order to get things right. Stalin saw right through it and eventually had him shot. He understood that was a piercing criticism,
cloaked as an endorsement. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Exactly. But it's exactly what you're talking about. Like, we have to be able to kind of get things wrong every now and then, and there can't be this, like, fear of what happens if I step outside the lines a little bit, because what you're going to end up having is people staying way inside the lines, right? Which is what the New York Times op-ed page looks like now,
right?
Where everybody agrees with everybody about everything, because the consequences can be very extreme now, and so that's not good either. I think you're right.
No, it really isn't. But in conclusion, I guess I would say, any optimistic thoughts for 2021, since we've been so dystopian?
Yeah, absolutely. I've often thought that a lot of this had to do with Trump. I think a lot of the arguments for not allowing people to listen to certain arguments or ideas grew out of the notion that, hey, we did that, we allowed all that free speech before, and look what happened, right? But maybe some of that will lessen when there's no Trump in office. And I think people are exhausted also from all the stress and the acrimony of the last 4 years.
Yeah.
I predicted at one point that the Biden years would be a little bit like the Carter years, like disco and just silliness and bad TV, because after a big upheaval, people just need to chill for a while, and I think that's what we've been through.
Well, I didn't have a mullet then, and I'm not going to have one now. I can't, actually. But with that, unfortunately, we have to leave it there. But Matt Taibbi, author, contributing editor of Rolling Stone, and also at taibbi.substack.com. Thanks, as always, for your great work. And thanks, as always, Matt, for coming on the program.
No, thanks, Richard, and Happy New Year.
Thank you. Thank you.
All right. Take care now.
You too. And we'll be right back after this. I am Richard RJ Eskow, and this is the 0 Hour.